I'm Niall McCrae, and I've been involved in what we might loosely call the freedom movement since beginnings of the scam, because let's be honest, it was a 100% total scam. As is the climate crisis, on which I've written a book called Green in Tooth and Claw. Some of you may have it already. Rob, my colleague there, standing at the back, holding up a copy. And Rob, I'm very pleased to say, is now an established author, because he has written with me this book on the history of pubs in Bexhill, which might seem a little bit of a quaint and niche topic, but it's very much what I want to talk about today, not just about Bexhill, but about the prospects and the survival of our this very distinct aspect of British culture, the traditional public house, which is very much under threat. And what we've seen over the decades is a long decline of the pub in terms of the numbers of outlets. We've all kinds of things have happened. I mean, I just think a few things that a few contributory factors just in the last 30 years or so. We had in 1997, Tony Blair, the new Labour government, sent out a text message to, I don't know how he got everybody's addresses, but all these young people were receiving text messages from Tony Blair himself saying, "Fuck licensing hours." Now, didn't that sound very rebellious? Didn't that sound all kinds of cool Britannia, the times there were Oasis and Pulp and Blur and all that sort of thing? But of course, Tony Blair wasn't really on the side of young people, and he wasn't really on the side of liberty. The point was that Tony Blair used his years of administration to take much further what had already started. It started with previous governments, but Tony Blair took it much further, which is a project to destroy traditional British society. So how does fuck licensing hours relate to that? Well, what you saw in the late 1990s was a change to licensing arrangements such that former bank buildings and cinemas and retail premises, but most significantly, traditional pubs were being converted into what was called theme bars. Do you remember these places? The Slug and Lettuce, the Rat and Parrot, the Firkin and whatever. And there was various of these theme bars. And these theme bars were the very opposite of what a pub should be about. Now, what sort of things do you look for in a pub? I mean, George Orwell wrote an essay about this called "The Moon Underwater," and that where he described what is the quintessential English pub. So what do you want? You want a crackling fire, you want a nice cozy environment, some real ale, good conversation, an orangey glow. It's all about comfort. And the traditional public house was what, and some of you may have seen the title of my speech today, which is called Save the Speakeasy. The pub was the speakeasy, and of course that term dates back to the American prohibition of alcohol back in the 1920s, which didn't work at all because alcohol was produced and lots of money was made in cities like Chicago with the mafia involvement and that sort of thing. So efforts to try and prevent people from drinking never work. Alcohol has been with us throughout human history. And of course, the establishment always tries to give alcohol a bad name, and there are plenty of people who help to give alcohol a bad name. But generally speaking, it's a social lubricant. It is a drug, of course. It can be described as a toxin if taken in large amounts. And of course, if you get a bad headache after a heavy night on the beer or wine, then you will get punished for that the next day because you will get the toxic effects of the excess alcohol you've had. But generally speaking, the British have a good, strong heritage of social drinking. And the pub is a place where people can speak with candor about things that are going on in the world, things that are going on in society, things that their government is doing to them. So obviously the government doesn't like pubs, and this has been a historic thing. I mean, kings in the past tried to get the ale houses shut down. Guy Fawkes, the gunpowder plot, was allegedly plotted in a pub on the Strand in London. And it's interesting how with COVID, when COVID, the debacle started, the pubs were still open, right? And if you think back to the hysteria that was around during the first months of 2020, when the lockdown was announced, that's when pubs were properly shut down. But before the lockdown, there was intense debate about whether men should still be allowed to go to their Weatherspoons and spread this virus, you know. So the schools had shut down, but the pubs were still open. And I believe that this was very deliberately done so that we would have the almost impossible to conceive notion of the British public demanding that pubs are closed. Who would have thought that would have been possible? But it was done through this contrast with, all these school children prevented from going to school and learning, and yet all these selfish men are still going to the boozer and spreading the germs. So the pubs were shut, and then they were gradually allowed to reopen. And you may remember these ridiculous rules that, and some of the more trendy bars, they actually seemed to quite delight in these rules. They would have outside there would often be like 6 rules, so that you would have to book online. You had to book a table, and the maximum sitting was 2 hours. Okay, and when you arrive, you have to go straight to your table, and only take your mask off once you sat down, because once you're sitting down, you're below the level of the virus. The virus flies a lot easier at 6 feet than it does at 3.5 feet. Yeah, yeah. It's like the planes crashing into the World Trade Center. You know, it's a lot more difficult to for the virus to fly at low altitudes, and that's why it's ever so believable that one of those passenger jets flew into the low-level Pentagon building. But anyway, I digress. So I'll save the rest of the conspiracy theories for others later. I think David Fleming, he's a noted conspiracy theorist. He'll be following me, right? But yeah, so we've got these ridiculous rules, and you have to sit down in a maximum group of 6, and you have to wait till somebody comes to take your order from the table. So you can't go to the bar. Oh, no. And you're not allowed to converse. No, you're not even allowed to look at anyone on a neighboring table. And this was actually enthusiastically policed by some of the trendier bars, because we know that the more middle-class wankers you have in a house, the more COVID regime you're going to get, yeah? Okay, whereas the traditional pubs, they just had to like put up with it and do what they had to do without getting shut down, right? So anyway, I was talking to a friend of mine who is one of these people who, haven't we all lost some friends and family over the last few years? I'm sure we've all had some, we just realized that we see things differently. And I had a couple of friends that I used to go regularly for mini sort of pub crawls in London. And both of these guys were absolute suckers for COVID-19, and they just couldn't understand my reluctance to believe in the validity of this virus and the coming vaccine. In fact, one of them was actually in the AstraZeneca vaccine trial. And so they were complete suckers for COVID-19. And when the pubs reopened, so initially you may remember pubs with outdoor areas were allowed to open because the virus doesn't like it outside. It's a bit cold. Especially, you're talking about May. It's still a bit nippy, isn't it? A bit cold for viruses to be out and about, And but eventually, I think about 3 or 4 weeks later, the pubs opened indoors, but you had to follow all these ludicrous rules that I've just mentioned. And so one of these friends of mine, he went to a pub in central London, and he said, I went to a pub for the first time since the COVID lockdown. So this is like months later. So he didn't go to any of it while it was the outdoor drinking thing. He waited till the pubs actually opened, and he went to this pub in central London. And I asked him, I said, what was it like? And he said, well, we had to book it online. We had to sit in a group of 6. There was actually 7 of us, but we had to kind of draw lots as to who would have to pull out, literally, right? And we sat there, and the sort of bar maid came over and took our order. And if you got up to go to the toilet, you had to put your mask on. Because the virus loves toilets, by the way, absolutely loves toilets. That's one of its key places to spread. And anyway, all these things, they're following all the rules. And then he said, but apart from that, it felt just like normal. So anyway, I'm probably not here really to focus on COVID. I'm here to talk about pubs. And I think it's very important that I'm not going to talk for much longer, actually, because I want to give it over to you. Because I'd like to know your experiences, what you think about what we can do, how much we should be doing to preserve this important part of our heritage. And I think the pub is particularly important now because the government and powerful people are conspiring against us. And that is why the term conspiracy theorist is being so smeared in mainstream media. Mainstream media are doing their job dutifully for the establishment at referring to all of us here today, I'm sure, we're all conspiracy theorists. Because what is a conspiracy theorist? Conspiracy theorist is someone who realizes that the government that we supposedly democratically elect isn't working for us. The police force isn't working for us. The NHS isn't working for us. Most of the institutions of our society have been corrupted. And one of the things in which they've been corrupted on, not the only thing by any means, is this net zero agenda, but there's other things also, woke agenda. And they were certainly corrupted by the COVID-19 hoax. So we've got a lot to talk about in pubs, haven't we? We've got a lot to talk about. And I don't suggest that you go to a pub and go looking for arguments with other people. But something I like to do, or I just find myself doing it, is when I'm in a pub and talking to some friends who think similarly to me, and I see people in the tables nearby, and you sometimes get the sense that people are listening in. So just raise the voices a little bit, make sure they get the full message. Yeah? And if we've got one on us, give them a copy of the Light newspaper on their way out. Yeah. So anyway, pubs are very much threatened. I mentioned the theme bars of the 1990s. There are two major contributors to the closure of pubs, which people in this room, myself included, may think was actually a good idea as something that had to be done. And one of them was the drink driving laws. Now, I'm not a complete zealot about drink driving. You know, I used to have a couple of pints and drive home. And I think you can be responsible. I don't believe in a zero alcohol limit, as they have in some countries. But there's no doubt that getting behind a wheel when you've had a whole evening of pints of beer is not a good idea, right? And so when the breathalyzer was brought in, and we cover this in our book, the history of Bexhill pubs, because although it's history of Bexhill pubs, we're actually talking really about the history of all pubs, this whole thing, this whole enterprise of British society and how much it's been curtailed by the establishment. So when the breathalyzer came in, that made it a lot harder. Blokes used to think, you know, I've had 5 pints, so I can have another one as long as I can walk in a straight line. And of course, blokes always believed that they would be able to walk in a straight line, because that's what the police used to use. If they stopped you, suspecting you of drink driving, asked you to walk in a straight line. And of course, big burly blokes would think, oh, I can do that. And of course, sometimes they would get caught. But once the breathalyzer came in, it was much harder to cheat the system. And the other thing, which, so that really sort of came in 80s onwards as a big threat to certainly country pubs. And it's why many country pubs today are not the pubs that maybe people here, certainly me, would like them to be. They've almost entirely been given over to food. And don't get me wrong, I think it's great that you can go to a country pub for a nice meal, but many of these pubs, they no longer look like pubs, do they? They're restaurants. Right. So another thing which happened to pubs is a smoking ban. And again, you know, I'm not a smoker, and I don't like coming home and my clothes, you know, totally, you know, the fumes of spending a night sitting next to people chain smoking can linger for quite a long time. And I'm not, I'm not a zealot against smoking at all, and I can see that smoking is not a good thing in many ways in a pub. It's not good for a pub that's doing food. It's not good for pubs that have children around, and smoking, I think, was becoming less and less sort of socially acceptable. And you see the numbers of people that smoke now. It's down to about, I think it's down to about 20% of the adult population smoke cigarettes now. But there's more people vaping. And here is a big inconsistency in pubs. Some pubs allow vaping and others don't. So you really don't know where you stand with that one. But the smoking ban came in, what was it? But May 2007. And it came in David's from Republic of Ireland. It came in Ireland a couple of years before, didn't it? Yeah, you better say what your job is, David, or else we'll be wondering. Environmental health officer, right? Okay. So, smoking ban, it definitely did lead to more pub closures, particularly what we call the wet pubs, the corner pubs, where local people would go and, you know, have 2 or 3 pints of ale, and have a few fags as well. Of course, people can still smoke at pubs. They can smoke in the garden. And I'm not sure if I would still hold to this view, and I'd be very interested to hear what you think, because we've kind of just accepted now that smoking should be banned in airports and hospitals and all these sorts of places. Funnily enough, somebody gave me to watch the BBC series from 2003, 2004. Hands up anyone that's watched it. Early Doors? Early Doors? No? No? Well, anyone watched The Royal Family? Yeah. It's done by the same people, Craig Cash. And it depicts a pub in the Manchester area called the Grapes. And it's really very fascinating to watch, because they're all smoking in the pub. And, of course, that's kind of unheard of now. And but that sort of pub would have been very much impacted by the smoking ban. And we've seen, Rob and I have done working on history of pubs in the Bexhill area, and many pubs closed in the 5 years or so after the smoking ban was brought in. So I'd be very interested, I'm going to stop talking a minute, I'd be interested in your views on that. But just to bring this right up to date, what are the threats to pubs now? Well, there's the increasing taxation. And it used to be that the tax system was the inverse of what it is now. So it used to be that if you went to, say, the pub called the Castle in Bexhill, you could buy a pint of beer at the bar for, I don't know, whatever the price was back. I'm talking back in the 60s, right? 4 pence or something like that. And you could also go to the off-sales counter at the end of your night in the pub and get some more beer to take home with you. And that beer would cost more. The off-sales, the tax was more. And then the government decided in its wisdom to invert this taxation regime so that supermarkets can sell beer, pile them high, grapes of 8 packs of fake Spanish lager and that sort of thing. And you know, that can be bought for a fraction of the price that you would pay for a beer at the bar. So that's just an example of how the taxation system has worked against the pub. But then the final thing I'd like to mention before we open this out for discussion, have you heard of the banter ban? Yeah, a few people nodding, yeah. Okay. So the banter ban is, let me give you what people think it is first, and I'll say what it really is. So the banter ban, people believe that this means that you could be arrested for having a politically incorrect conversation in the pub. That's what people think it is, and that's what people fear. And in a way, this is what the government wants you to think, because they want you to be in a state of fear and to watch what you're saying all the time. But in fact, the banter ban doesn't really exist as an entity. It's a nickname for a change to employment law, whereby if somebody is working in a shop or a bar and they're exposed to customers saying offensive things, that employee has a right to sue their employer. Now, that's different, isn't it? But it can have the same ultimate effect, which is that landlords in a pub won't want people discussing things in too kind of colourful terms, sitting on bar stools, because, you know, they could have a young university student who's serving at the bar who's been immersed in all the woke ideology. And here's some grunting Herberts talking about trans ideology, or the boat people coming across the channel. So That's what the banter ban is. But it's just, you can see it's relentless, this onslaught on our public house, such that there is about a quarter of the pubs left than there was around the time I was born. That's a massive amount of pubs that have closed. So I think we've got to do our best to keep these places open. And that means giving the government lots of money, because you know how much a pint is? I was in a pub in central London the other day, and it was £8 for a pint. £8, right? Okay. So you're giving the government a lot of money, right? But I think the pub is so important that we really need to keep it going. It's not enough to just think, oh, it's nice, we've got this quaint traditional inn down the road, and to go in there on Boxing Day for a pint or something like that. That's not enough. You have to frequent these places. I'm not saying go there every night. I'm not even saying go there every week. But we have to use it or lose it. And that's the line that I'd like to end on just before handing over to you for how you see this. And that is use it or lose it. Thank you.